Welcome back to Patriot Week's vlog. We're going to take a short detour this week. Instead of discussing the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, we're going to focus on a monumental historical figure, George Washington. We're doing this because we are celebrating what most people call President's Day. The reality is it's still legally Washington's birthday, but because Richard Nixon and Congress passed when we celebrate the holiday from Washington's actual birthday to a Monday in February, so people get a 3-day weekend, and because businesses across the country have started calling it President's Day and have been, having those President's Day sales of monumental import, the idea of celebrating Washington alone has fallen to the wayside. Well, we're here to rectify that. George Washington is a critical American hero and figure, and we really should understand more about him. He is someone that we celebrate during Patriot Week in connection with the idea of having a union, and you'll understand why that is in just a moment, and a social compact. Washington walked into history doing something that we might not think was very important, but it was incredibly important. He was asked to survey lands that had not been yet explored by the Europeans and the colonists. Of course, there were Native Americans there, but to the colonists and the explorers from Europe, they had never been there. And he surveyed hundreds upon hundreds of miles. It was very difficult work. It was very threatening. The weather turned cold. He almost froze to death more than once, fell into a frozen river. All kinds of adventures happened that most Europeans and colonists could not even imagine. And he wrote it all down in a pamphlet. And that pamphlet became basically a bestseller, and he became a household name for doing an adventure that most could never even have thought of. After that, the next time he became monumentally important was when he assisted a general from the British forces who were sent out to confront the French. And what was happening was the French had established some footholds in what the British thought was British territory. And they sent out some troops to confront the French. And basically Washington was the aide-de-camp, the right-hand man of the British commander. And Washington leads a force, but he actually gets into a skirmish with some French, and he kills some French officers in basically an ambush. That eventually led to the encirclement of the British army by the French. And they also had some Native American allies. And this becomes very interesting because the British are not very good at tactics in the forest, but of course the Native Americans are. So they encircle the British, and at the command of their chief, they start massacring the officers. Because back then, the officers stuck out like a sore thumb. It was very easy to identify them, and basically they started picking them down one by another. The British commander was eventually shot, and he collapsed and was dying from the wounds that he received. And Washington, of all those people that were being encircled, kept a cool head. He was able to rally the troops and do an orderly retreat. And this was also quite magnificent because he had basically been ill and been on horseback for 24 hours, but he had the physique that no one else could have possibly had to be able to proceed with his leadership. And also, he was probably the best horseman in the colony. So that combination of things allowed him to escape and lead the troops out. But it was even deeper than that. The Indian chief in charge of the forces there, he understood that at a certain point Washington was taking command, and he ordered his warriors to kill Washington. And after a few minutes, and I'm paraphrasing of course, he turned to his warriors and said, "I told you to shoot down British officer. Why is he still alive?" And the warrior next to him said, "Chief," again paraphrasing, "we've taken about 17 shots at him and we cannot hit him." At which point the chief said, "Stop. He is blessed by the Great Spirit, and he will be the chief of a great empire someday." So they stopped shooting at Washington, and he was able to escape. 2 horses were shot from underneath Washington, and when Washington got off his horse, he took off his uniform, his blazer basically, and went like this, and there were 4 holes in the coat. Remarkable. I don't know what your religious faith is, but I believe that that is a sign of divine intervention. Washington returns to the colonies. Eventually, that conflagration becomes the impetus for what we call the French and Indian War. Europeans call the 7 Years' War. That's basically a world war across the globe, pitting French and British forces against each other, along with other forces, in a dramatic death struggle. The British win, but it causes them to expend an enormous amount of money, and they go into heavy debt. That heavy debt leads to taxation without representation. Taxation without representation, of course, leads to the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party, of course, leads to additional, because the British were already doing some nasty things to the colonists, but some additional oppressive actions like the Boston Port Bill, closing down Boston, closing down colonial legislatures, additional taxation without representation, suppressing the right to the jury, all kinds of other acts that related to American oppression and resulted in the American Revolution. At which point, the colonists went to Washington, asked him to come out of retirement to lead the British forces, which he did, although very humbly. He was very concerned that he would not be able to measure up to the expectations. And he did. Although he lost several battles, his basic tactical and strategic objective was to wear down the British through a war of attrition and to make it too costly for the British to win. And he prevailed. The British eventually sued for peace, and there was a peace accord, the Treaty of Paris, which led to the Americans being freed of the British Empire, and we became a free nation. At which point, Washington did something which no one expected him to do. He went to Congress, literally walked down the aisle of Congress, and handed his sword in. And at that time, he was called the American Cincinnati, who was a general from Roman times who had also returned back to a farm. Washington went back to Mount Vernon. Cincinnatus went back to his own humble farming and relinquished power after he had been made a dictator and had ultimate control of the Romans. Washington didn't have ultimate control, but many people thought that he could take control, and instead of doing that, he returned to his own farm, Mount Vernon. And things went pretty well until a few months and then a few years after the peace. Americans realized that they needed a stronger federal government, and they also needed a government that would not be oppressive, and they also needed a government that would hem in the states who at times were violating the unalienable rights of the people. And so they decided to call a constitutional convention. And Washington was asked, much against his will, to serve as the presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention, as the president. And that's why we celebrate Washington in Patriot Week, because he presided over the Constitutional Convention, which led to the written social compact that we are still governed today, of course with some amendments. And then Washington was elected as the first president of the United States, unanimously. Only time that's happened. And then he was elected again as president. And then he did something which no one foresaw, much to the chagrin of his friends, but to the happiness of his wife. He retired and went back to Mount Vernon, at which point, having a second time relinquished power on his own accord, King George III, his nemesis, declared that Washington was the greatest character of the age. Washington died a few years later, but he set a precedent for American presidents to voluntarily retire after 2 terms, which stayed all the way until Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that precedent eventually became constitutionalized in an amendment to the United States Constitution. He is revered, and rightfully so, because he was the indispensable man. He was indispensable in the American Revolution because he was the one person that people from the North and the South could unite around in connection with winning the fight against the British. And he was indispensable in connection with the Constitutional Convention because without his presence there and without his support behind the Constitution, it is very unlikely that the Constitutional Convention would have succeeded or that the Constitution would be ratified. And he's indispensable as a model citizen because he was willing to do what needed to be done to preserve liberty. And then to preserve liberty even more, he was willing to retire from the scene of politics. His ego did not get in the way of what was right. He was a remarkable man. I think we often forget, in the hustle bustle of our days, about why he really was the indispensable man. And so we pay tribute to Washington today, as we should throughout the entire year. God bless you, and God bless America.